In this session, we're going to discuss investor landscape. My name is Mark Correnti. I'm Director of Impact Capital at the Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship. Our agenda is fivefold. Firstly, capital types versus company stage. Second, we're going to discuss fundraising in the missing middle. Third, investments beyond the missing middle and the scaling of organizations. Fourth, the alignment between enterprises and investors. And fifth, actual funding facilitation with our enterprises and a network of investors that we have here at the Miller Center. First, let's take a look at capital types and company stage. In the beginning, there's the concept stage, which typically is financed by competitions, crowdsourcing, and particularly friends and family. Then there's a startup phase, which is heavily grant funded, followed by the growth stage, which is typically debt in nature, and then finally a more mature stage, which starts a series of equity financing. But there's much more beyond this, and no one size fits all. Further, we have impact investors that are typically in the missing middle, which are deal sizes below $2 million, as well as other investors, which include commercial investors and strategic investors that typically show up beyond $2 million on their way up to $10 million and more. Other forms of capital are also present. There's early philanthropic equity during the startup phase and the growth phase, as well as mezzanine debt that can start up in the early phases and growth phases as well. And there's also quasi-equity, which takes place in the growth and mature phases, which include convertibles and other financial instruments. Finally, we're going to take a look at grants as well and establish the fact that grants should be looked at always when looking for additional financing, whether in the startup phase, throughout the growth phase, and even sometimes into the scaling phase. There's still opportunities for grant financing. First, let's take a look at capital types with deal sizes less than $2 million as defined by Andy, which is called the missing middle of finance. First, let's look at grants. Again, as we described earlier, grants can be used throughout the growth stage. We include in this presentation some areas that grants might still fund, whether it's in the area of establishing new markets, moving into new geographies, enhanced products and services layered in to establish distribution channels, new processes in terms of allowing the customer themselves to design product, as well as employee training, women's empowerment, and even advocacy. Secondly, debt. Please exhaust all forms of cheaper debt as you look at financing throughout the life cycle of your organization. Those cheaper forms of debt might come from DFIs, might come from OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which requires U.S. citizenship and ownership, but has interest rates that are very low in the 1 to 4 to 5% range. We also want you to consider looking at interest rates versus inventory turnover. In some countries, some of the debt is as high as 14 to 16% or higher, and you may have to work with those forms of debt. Therefore, your inventory turn, if you're in the products arena, may have to be more quickly established so that the number of turns per debt that you use is enhanced and lowering the overall carrying cost of the inventory that's in your warehouses. Finally, we look at also personal collateral requirements. In some countries, personal collateral will be required. We're working with institutions to remove some of these considerations, but that work is ongoing. In early forms of mezzanine debt and other forms of early financing, there may be some enhanced conditions attached to financing in the forms of warrants or equity kickers. Equity kickers are, to some degree, additional equity on top of debt that is established in lieu of paying an interest rate. And then in later forms of late stage financing where convertibles are used and convertible features understanding valuations and interest rates are important. And then finally, some debt is required or predicated upon future rounds of actual equity. In the areas of equity itself, there are entities out there that are doing early stage philanthropic equity. Know who they are. In the Series A and B, in later growth stages, understand that there's market rate equity and non-market or concessional market rate equity. Try to determine valuation expectations on behalf of yourself and would-be investors before you start. And there are forms of ways to bridge these valuation expectations in the form of ratcheting that we get to in later modules. For investor types greater in deal sizes greater than 2 million beyond the missing middle, new investors come into the forefront, and we need to understand who they are. The first of which we have to understand is that the amount of equity that is taking place, the amount of deals that are taking place from 2 to 5 million to 10 million is actually far less than the missing middle in most emerging country and frontier markets. So understand that the scarcity of equity actually goes up as we go beyond the missing middle, upwards to about $10 million, and then more financing comes to bear. There's an increased presence of commercial equity, which is most interested in future growth rates, and increased presence in strategic equity, which is most interested in introducing new potential products to existing product lines and distribution channels, as an example. There are remaining impact investors, but those impact investors are going to be more market rate in terms of their return expectations. And finally, there is blended capital. Grant forms are still available at the direct deal level, but typically with small and medium-sized foundations as compared to larger foundations. Investor alignment is critical. Most people today, most platforms today deal at a primary level with investor alignment that consists of geography, sectors, capital types, and the amount of capital that needs to be raised. At the Miller Center, we take this to a secondary level where we really try to tighten up alignment between our enterprises and investors. This can include return expectations on the part of investors, subsector investment theses, SE types, whether it's a nonprofit, for-type, or hybrid, the stage at which the company or enterprise is at, the ambition to scale, what are the use of funds, and other considerations. We either even go beyond a second level and go to a tertiary level where we look at the available collateral for collateralized loans, whether personal or not. What is going to be the source of repayment? Competitive advantages, the available liquidity, and even as you get into later stage rounds, what is the expected equity exit potential? Finally, Miller Center actively engages investors on your behalf. We do this in 5 primary ways. First and foremost, we begin with a proprietary investor database of over 550 impact investors. Secondly, we perform outreach to those investors, as many as we can, to understand more in-depth understanding of their investment preferences. Thirdly, we make high tailored matches between our SEs, our social enterprises, and those investors. We then make quality recommendations to the investors themselves based upon the social enterprises that we are working with. And when those investors have the requisite interest in a particular social enterprise, we make formal introductions.